Welcome back to another episode of the Piano Pedagogy podcast. I'm Jacqueline Beckoff. I own a successful music studio in Southern California, as well as defined music teacher. With me, as always, is Arianne Lacra,
Hi.
and she is also the owner of a successful music studio in Southern California. What's been going on in your studio lately, Arianne?
I'm just planning the recital for now. It's going to be June 1st. I thought it would be in May. We switched to June. It's going to be at a nice college chapel. I'm very excited. And we're just trying to figure out what each student is going to work on for the recital at this stage. Also, getting
Awesome.
the word out.
Yeah, I think that's great. Setting up independent recitals is such an awesome milestone. Because you have control over everything, right? And that's such a huge thing for you. That's great. I'm also getting ready for my recital. My recital is in 4 weeks. It's in on April 20th. I didn't realize that it was going to be on the fourth month of the year, on the 20th day of that month, if you get what I mean. But it is on 420. And
Oh,
but my students are getting ready. All of our workshops for this month are over. So that means that the next workshops on the 31st, the 7th or the 8th maybe, and then the week after that, we're going to be doing our mock recitals, which is super, super exciting. Yeah. Um,
woohoo.
but other than that, not too much going on in my studio. I had a mother of a 3.5-year-old reach out. Um, and I don't want to teach a 3.5-year-old. So I said that
Tough.
perhaps in a year and a half, that 5-year mark is where I'm comfortable with. I tried once, I should say. I tried once to do music lessons for babies from the ages of 0 to like 3. And I hated the experience. It was the
Mhm.
worst thing I have ever done. Is all of my personal least favorite things about music teaching, with none of the fun stuff like phrasing. Um, by the way, our topic is phrasing today. So,
Woohoo! Phrasing.
um, phrasing, what an important concept for pianists, because we are at such a disability on our instrument for phrasing specifically compared to wind instruments and stringed instruments. Um, and I think that's so interesting because the piano is so much more versatile in so many ways, but sustaining a note is our one weakness, right?
Yeah, with phrasing, one would think that because the piano is literally named after the fact that it can be louder and softer, etc. Piano forte, forte piano, piano forte, that phrasing would be a cinch on piano. And in ways, it can be as long as you have pretty solid technique and lots of experience knowing how to phrase things as a student. So, as music educators, piano educators, it's our job to kind of help build that sense of what phrasing works, what might not, build that sense of what balance between the hands sounds like, what articulation is, what it means to express dynamics in a way that's a little bit more involved than just the loud and the soft of it.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I always like to explain that little fact to students when I first introduce them to piano and forte, that it's literally where the name of our instrument came from. But it is definitely not an easy task, and it certainly requires developing an ear for for things, right? You have to have a strong musicianship element to be able to listen to the decay of notes, to be able to handle phrasing. What's the earliest you've ever introduced a student to phrasing? Like, what's the youngest you've ever introduced a student to phrasing?
Oh, it's possible to start it off immediately, even with a kindergartner. They get it. I mean, even if you can't explain it totally in verbal terms, if you demonstrate it and you model it, I think any student can kind of catch your drift.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that I'm perhaps too heavy on the explanation part of things. But I certainly don't introduce them until they've learned legato. Um, because in that whole primer first book that I use, I don't ever talk about articulations until the very last chapter when I'm starting the preparation stage learning for what's coming in the next book. But I focus basically on dynamics, and don't talk about articulations. And there really is no balance between the hands to speak of at that stage because they're not playing hands together from the music that is in the book. Um, but I think that maybe I should try to lean less on the explanation side of things, and try to be more, um what's the word, more demonstration based. But I want my students to be able to understand the principle behind what they're doing, so I think the first time I introduce phrasing is when they're in the first level of the for kids in the level one piano adventures. They introduce the slur, and they introduce a technique gesture called the wrist float off. Are you
Mhm.
familiar with the wrist float off?
Oh yeah.
And that I give a simple rule at that point. The last note of a slur, unless we're told otherwise, should be the softest note of the slur. I think that's the most basic I'm able to explain phrasing. I don't really talk about the nitty-gritty of it yet, but with the last note being the softest, it's I mean, that's to me the most fundamental part of phrasing, the easiest way to introduce it. How do you talk to kindergartners about it?
I use a lot of what's the word? What's the word I'm looking for? Onomatopoeia. It's kind of like onomatopoeia and gibberish combined into one with a lot of goofy facial expressions. So I'll one thing I do a lot in my lessons, whether we're talking about phrasing or anything else, is that when I want to model something and I want them to hear it in the original register that the repertoire calls for, I'll have them switch places. Say, you can sit in the teacher's spot, I will sit on the bench, and I'll show you exactly, how this needs to be done. And I'll look at them, and let's say that it's a sequence with um I don't know, groups of three note staccatos that are going up stepwise. So it's a pattern like C D E. I don't know if that's really a C. I'm sorry for all the people out there with perfect pitch, by the way, but I'm going to assume this is C C C C D E D E F E F G. But I won't say the letter names. It'll be like bum 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 bum, and and I'll be looking at them with these crazy eyes. And instantly, without saying a word, I have conveyed to them that this sequence is growing in intensity and perhaps volume. And they're able to replicate it because I'm gesturing so overtly and almost in this extra kind of way to make it
Right.
really clear what is wanted.
Interesting. I think that this is such a fascinating topic because it sounds like you and I have very different approaches to it. So I'm loving that we're talking about this. But that is such an interesting ear first approach, right? That's such an ear first approach. And I perhaps should try to modify my approach to be more ear first. I mostly talk about it with, um, when I get into the nitty gritty about phrasing, which is usually with adult students. Um, because they're able to. I love my adult students because we're able to have those in-depth conversations at such an earlier stage in the lessons.
Yeah.
Um, if I had, and that, um, w- we've talked about how the different age groups are, they're just so different, right? And I love my teen students. I like some of I like some of my younger kids, but I have a hard time getting as invested as I do when I'm speaking with adults because we're able to have those in-depth conversations from such an early stage. I use the concept of energy. I use the concept of energy that energy needs to be added into the phrase because long notes inherently lose energy. So we need to
Hmm.
add energy as we approach the long note, and then when we after that long note, the energy is naturally decreasing, and any notes after that long note need to match the decay of that note. This energy approach is no one ever taught it to me. I'm not sure where it came from. I think that, after I finished college in my undergrad and decided not to continue with my master's degree, there was so much stuff just bouncing around in my head, and having the opportunity to teach it when I had to start teaching phrasing, really in depth, it really forced me to kind of grapple with how do I translate this into something that someone else can understand.
Hmm.
So long notes. There was this class. I had a professor who no longer works at the college. He moved on. Um, I hated that professor. I despised that professor. And you know exactly who I'm talking about too. I'm not going to say his name, but you know exactly who I'm talking about. He was teaching a piano literature class, and the one thing that he has ever said to me that I remember, and because he's a very harsh teacher, we would do our
Hmm.
juries, and we would get these jury forms back, and it would be filled with detailed feedback from two out of the three professors. And then he would just be like, wasn't bad or needs work. And so I don't like this professor. But he said to me when we were talking about Baroque interpretation, he said not to the class, he said that short notes take us to long notes, right? Short notes take us to long notes. And I think that one thing that he said that I've retained helps inform my approach to phrasing, because those short notes, they build up energy because long notes inherently lose energy.
Hmm.
And that is a big part of my approach to the explanation of phrasing. So how do you talk about phrasing with adults?
Oh my gosh. I'm so glad that you brought up that point that you learned in that piano literature class, because I remember I we might have been in the same class. We
Do
might
do
have been
you
in the
remember
same
the
class.
day that he yelled at all of us for not knowing enough about the things that it was his job to teach us?
Right. Yeah, 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 yeah. It was back in should I say the year? It was back my first year of the program. I remember it vividly. And when I had an aha moment too, when that professor talked about the fact that smaller notes are leading up to a longer note, and it reminded me of a time when I was in boarding school. My other professor mentioned that when you phrase things, try to think of a snowball rolling down a hill, or try to think of the physics of
Physics,
how
yes.
how notes how objects operate in the world according to the laws of physics. And I thought, oh my gosh, yeah, totally. Like if you have a basketball and you're just dribbling it, and then you stop dribbling it and you let it go and do its own thing, because of gravity, it starts bouncing high, then a little lower, a little lower, a little lower, a little lower,
Right.
until it's just dribbling and then it stops. And you can apply any kinds of things like that, or like what you were saying with, it reminds me of when you have lots of small notes. It's like climbing up a hill on a bicycle or a car in a lower gear, so you have to turn, you have to
Right.
pedal faster because you're in a lower gear. And then when you go down the hill, that's the long note, maybe you need to switch into a higher gear. This is something that in teaching, a big schema in your student, like an adult student, or someone who's in their late teens, really helps with, because they know the laws of physics, whether
Right.
whether they're an engineer who's an amateur musician, or just someone who's taken a physics class, or someone who has lived their life and
Right.
ridden a
Yeah.
bike and played sport and they know how it works. You can transform someone's playing when you teach them to fish, so to speak, by empowering them with that possibility of thinking of musical phrasing as if it were a physical phenomenon happening in real life.
Yeah. Relating things to students, and this is going to sound weird. This is something we've talked about in a future episode. Relating things to students' real life lived experiences is really valuable, right?
Mhm.
Because students of all ages are building a mental model of how the world works, right? And a lot of that is, they try something and they see what happens, right? There's a lot of experimentation involved in that for young children. Adults, as you said, they have a deep understanding of how the laws of physics practically work. They can't explain the laws of physics, most of them, but they have an understanding of when you drop something, it'll bounce once, it'll bounce twice lower, and then it'll three, four, it'll get lower and lower, right? As you said with the basketball, right? And that ties so nicely into um, the energy system, the energy explanation, the way that I conceive phrasing as being, right? Because and I think that the mountain idea is interesting, but I wonder, do students, because it works on the way up, but like on the way down they get faster and faster and more energetic. Isn't that kind of like the opposite of what we want them to think? Does that ever come up?
Sure. I mean, it depends on what's going on in the piece. Is this an inanimate object, or could it be maybe um, someone or a creature? I mean,
Right.
if you ever think about, have you ever just watched, like really watched Tom and Jerry? And
What?
Tom and Jerry the
I
cartoon,
know who Tom and Jerry are. Yes, I've seen a few episodes of it, but I don't know if I qualify for someone who's really watched Tom and Jerry.
or really listen to the soundtrack that goes along with the animated characters and how they run and interact with one another and their dynamic. um the symphony orchestra that plays along with this visual animation is so in tune with what the characters are feeling. They could defy the laws of physics because it's a cartoon, but the music is still so aesthetically. I mean, it's so apt to go along with that particular animation that it just calls for you to imagine these different scenarios. So, what kind of imagery goes with whatever piece you're playing? I don't think that that's a question that any student of a certain age can fail to answer. Everybody has an imagination, and if you model a piece for someone, you can always ask them what imagery it evokes, and then have them try to follow that imagery, whether it defies the laws of physics
Right.
or not. And if it's a fugue or something contrapuntal, something classical with different voices, who do these voices remind you of when you listen to a recording or a demonstration of your piece?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm reminded of the term Mickey Mousing. Have you heard that term before?
Uh-huh.
That's kind of what's happening in Tom and Jerry, right? I love those
Yeah.
old school animations and old school movies where they're running. Let's make the music sound like it's running, right? Let's
Hmm.
let something
Exactly.
just broke on screen. Let's make it sound like something just broke in our music, right? So I love that. First of all, I love that. I think that's really cute. That thought happened. I recall doing a composition project years and years ago. It was a cartoon. I don't remember what cartoon. It was an old school cartoon, and it was like a spooky Halloween thing. It was like 4 minutes long, but the assignment was for the students to write an accompaniment on the piano that goes along with what's happening on screen.
Hmm.
Um, And you can actually find on the High Desert Piano YouTube page, you can find a playlist filled with a lot of this. I made it a duet project. Each student was responsible for half of it. And
Wow.
yeah, but regardless, that's off topic. But yeah, physics, right? I like to think, this is again off topic, but when I talk about retardandos with students, I tell them that it needs to obey the laws of physics, right? It needs to make sense, right? You can't suddenly
Exactly.
be going from this fast speed to a slower one. You're missing all of the in between stuff, and it's the laws of physics, right? For adults, I explain retardandos as pulling up to a red light in a good way, right? You're
Mhm.
not just driving right up to the red light and then slamming on the brakes, right?
Yeah.
You're supposed to slow down as you get there. Um, and I tried
Gradual.
that same analogy with students based off of what their parents do at red lights, but it doesn't hit the same way, right? It doesn't hit the same way because they're not the one in control of that situation, right? They're not the one in control of that situation. And the worst thing that I find, if it always makes me feel so awkward, is when I give an analogy to a student, and then they just look at you with those blank eyes, and their eyes are telling you, "I have no idea. You're so old. What are you talking about?"
Yeah,
And it's awful, right? It's terrible.
it
But
happens.
um, but physics, yeah, I think that that's a great way to think about it. And I also like to think that I also like to explain that phrasing is us hiding the fact that we're just banging on strings with hammers, right? Because
Mm,
at the core, that's what it is with a piano, right? We're striking strings with hammers, and that's very different from a violin, from a wind instrument, from stringed instruments, from everything, right? It's very different. Um, and I like to call it our one weakness here, and we need to work to cover that up. Do you ever have students sing the phrase as they're trying to play it?
oh, yeah. Some of them naturally gravitate towards singing the phrase when they're learning it. Others, it takes a little bit more coaxing. Probably the majority, I have to kind of prompt it first. But as you said in a previous episode, it really helps to just get the student singing from day one so that
Right.
they know that it's par for the course in piano lessons. And it's pretty effective because to a certain extent, we all speak, so we all can sing and we can vocalize, and it's innate. I mean, it takes lifetimes of training to become like an amazing singer, but
Yeah, yeah,
let's do
the
it.
singing, some people feel really awkward about it, but it is such a helpful thing because our voice is just, it's so much easier. We do phrasing essentially in every sentence that we speak, right? Our voice goes down, it gets softer at the end of a sentence, unless we have an exclamation mark, which could also happen in music with an accent or a crescendo, right? So often just getting them to speak it. Um, and that's why I like that so many of our method books have words for so many songs, right? So many of
Hmm.
our method books, they have words for songs. And I know that some teachers, myself included in the past, they're just like, why are those lyrics there? They're useless, right? But students like to sing. Students like to sing, and it's so useful to talk about rhythm with those lyrics and use them to help with things like phrasing, right?
Yeah,
Um, you teach violin as well, right?
I do.
Do you have any violin students that also take piano?
Not of late, but I have in the past. Hmm.
How do they handle like musicianship stuff, like phrasing and those kind of things? Do they have an advantage, you think?
Oh yeah, I think there's an advantage because any of the skills you learn in violin, you can apply to piano and vice versa. And okay, not all of the skills, but so many of them. I mean, it's transferable from instrument to instrument. We all have linguistic knowledge when we know one language, and then our our universal grammar and syntax and all of that translates over to when we have to learn another language, kind of in the same way as knowing multiple instruments. Um, but what really my favorite thing when it comes to phrasing is when a student has reached the point where they can start to really understand how analysis works, like chord analysis, Roman numerals, all that kind of stuff, because then you can begin to notice smaller phrases within other larger overarching phrases.
Right.
And at that point you can start to predict when to intensify excuse me, your performance, based on cues such as when the dominant shows up in a major um, movement of concert work, you know, or when the tonic comes back in, when a resolution is there, when you can relax a little bit, um, things like that.
Yeah, the analysis is so important because the other form that I explain phrasing in, other than this energy one, is tension and release, right? Which is,
Mhm.
I mean, it's a natural thing. And when students lack the understanding to understand which chords they're playing, that takes out an entire dimension of their knowledge about their piece, right? I have some adult students who can play well, but their theoretical knowledge is limited, and sometimes it's a very hard sell for me to teach them music theory. Sometimes they're just not interested in it; they'd much rather just do the playing. And I'm also not the best at managing time. Sometimes I will get very into a particular. Uh, a piece, and I'm going to want to focus on that, and then we run out of time, and things like, and I'm terrible because things like techniques, scales, arpeggios, chords, things like music theory, those are the things that I push to the wayside if I need to, because it just seems like such an immediate thing. We're preparing for a recital, we got to do this. But that's another conversation. But tension and release is so interesting, right? And one lived experience that I use is, I ask students, when something is repeated, when something is repeated, what does that do to our tension level, right? And the example I give them is reality TV, right? Reality TV, when we get to the commercial break and we're waiting to see which chef is going to get fired out of a cannon because they suck at cooking, right? They're always like, and the chef, reaction shots, that's leaving is reaction shots, commercial break. We come back and then they're like, the chef that's leaving is, and then they say the chef. And we're like, what does that do to our tension level, right? What does that do when something is repeated over and over again? What does
Mhm.
that do?
It
Well, we
elevates
know
it.
as human beings, it can't repeat forever, right? We know that reality TV can only jerk us around for so long before they tell us who's going to be gone. So we're waiting for that, right? And that's how they get us, because they're like, come back after the commercial. Not that I have commercials, I don't watch broadcast TV anymore, but come back and see who's getting launched out of a cannon, right? So
Mm.
I talk about the famous bum 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 bum,
Mhm.
and my singing is worse than yours, so I know those aren't the notes. And I talk about, that's major. This wasn't the first time, but it was a big deal that he repeated three notes before going down to a different one, right? Repeating notes like that wasn't something that was really done. I think that was in some literature class. Maybe that professor I don't like taught me that too. Um,
Yeah, I remember that vaguely. The whole motif thing. Yeah.
yeah, and then the fact that that motif is then sequenced, ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-bum, right? That we know that it has to stop at some point, right? We know that it has to stop at some point. So when we have something that is being repeated or sequenced, it's building tension, and we should do the same thing with our phrasing, right? We should do the same thing with our phrasing. We should build. And then when that moment finally ends, and the repeated thing, the sequenced thing, whatever that is that's being, that's getting repetition, whenever that breaks, that's the moment when our audience breathes a sigh of relief. And you were
Mhm.
mentioning chord analysis. So part of phrasing, I think, is giving our students the tools to understand the types of tension that are naturally building in our piece, whether it's harmonic tension, whether it's motivic tension, whether it's music raising up, ascending arpeggios, ascending scales, short notes going to long notes. There are lots of different things that we can use to help our students understand phrasing, right? And some of them require a good deal of theoretical knowledge. And it's important that they get that theoretical knowledge because it's one of my adult students, she or he was, or they, whoever they are, I'm not naming names here. The student was working on a very difficult piece. It was one of the most difficult piece that she's ever worked on. It was essentially, it wasn't an etude. It wasn't explicitly written as an etude, but it was essentially an etude for broken chords and voicing over a lot of left hand stuff. And um, one of the things that I suggested was that she do the harmonic analysis to analyze the chords because it's so heavily chord based, and then she can make herself a memory map with the chords and then memorize it from there. But we realized she doesn't understand the chords. She has no idea really
Mm.
what's going on with the chords. And I think that that's a travesty when students, they can play something, but they can't understand it.
Do you know about Bloom's taxonomy, Jackie?
I don't believe so. Wait, say more. Sounds vaguely
Okay,
familiar.
right. It's my favorite thing to bring up. I think our professor, Professor Edwards, has heard me bring this up in like all of her classes, and she's probably sick of it at this point. But I learned about it uh, in school before being a music major, and what it is it's a pyramid of how learning works,
Right. Yeah, I
and
think I
the
took an
bottom.
educational psychology course, maybe.
Yes, it's kind of in educational psychology, and it starts off with application. You apply yourself, you do the thing that you are meant to do. You play the piece. The next one is comprehension. You're kind of comprehending what you're playing. You sort of have a base level understanding of it. The next part of the of this triangle, this pyramid, is okay. Wait, comprehension, application, synthesis, then there's analysis, and then evaluation. So once you reach the level where you can evaluate something, um, you can start to actually add your own thoughts on, if you had composed this, what would you have done differently, if anything, or what was the composer going for. You can truly evaluate it, and like write, an essay on it that's effective. But it takes a lot of instructional energy to to fight gravity and bring your student up through the rungs of this pyramid, through the Bloom's taxonomy, and it's really not easy, which is why, we're sort of going off topic here, but I also feel it's relevant to phrasing. um oh yes, thank you.
Those
Yes,
of you watching the video
comprehension.
version of this podcast, I have a picture on the screen right now of the triangle. And it's remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and then at the very top, it's creating.
Yeah, there you go. Um and so that's Bloom's taxonomy, and I see it play out in real time. After giving students, say, a note speller so that they can understand the notes of the staff, the next step for me is maybe to do Keith Snell's music theory, or maybe the fundamentals of music theory, little book, theory books. uh, and then students can start to really get to the point where they can do harmonic analysis after going through all the chord theory, all of the, circle of fifths, and what do you call them, the parts of a scale, tetrachords, all that good stuff. And it takes a lot of work, not always in classwork, a lot of homework also, and motivation, like self-motivated students, and maybe some enforcement from the parents, some flashcards, that family takes up after notes after the lesson, in between lessons. All of this is required to really bolster that student's understanding of any piece.
Yeah, I think that is so important, right? That if a student truly knows something when they're able to create something with the concept, right? Um, and that stage is at the very top, right? I think there was another educational theory that Professor Edwards teaches in her pedagogy course about preparation. I don't remember the whole thing. I know it was preparation stage, and then there's the top one, the highest level one is, I believe, generalization.
Hmm.
Generalization, taking that knowledge and applying it elsewhere. But knowing that your students understand something is super duper important, right? And I'll toot my horn a little bit here. I use an app
Sure.
called Flip. I use an app called Flip. It's primarily used by K through 12 teachers, and some college teachers use it too, where students are able to create their own videos. It's almost like TikTok. It's almost like TikTok. It wasn't always like TikTok, but they've changed it to be like TikTok. You can use filters, you can use text on them, you can do video transitions. It's the whole thing. But my students have a weekly flip assignment, and sometimes it is related to a concept that they maybe learned the previous week, so that they've had a little time to play with it. Like when a student learns um, forte and piano,
Hmm.
very basic stuff. The next week, I'll have them do an assignment where they do a couple things. They draw it for us on a piece of paper so that they can show us what it looks like. They tell us what it means, and then they demonstrate it on their piano. And that's the same thing for everything, right? I recently taught a student the F major scale, and we know what a pain in the neck the F major scale is for the right hand because of that massive 4-1 cross under, right? Um, and I had her record a video explaining the notes of the F major scale, and I had her explain why the F major scale is such a difficult scale for the right hand, and then demonstrate how to use alignment to correct, or not to
Hmm.
correct, but handle the difficulties that the F major scale presents. And then if another student is learning the F major scale and they're struggling a bit, I can then use the video that my first student recorded as a tutorial for the later student to use as a reminder. So I've turned them into little content creators, right? Some of them get really into it. Some of them use graphics and they write script. I have a student who writes a script for her flip videos so that she knows exactly what she wants to say. But it's taking something that they've learned in lessons and they're having to teach it to someone else. They're having to create something new with it, right? They're having to take this concept, break it apart, put it back together, and demonstrate it for somebody on a video. And it serves a dual function because not only is it with new concepts, but if I notice that a student is struggling with a concept that they've previously learned, like articulations or staccato, or I had a student that forget the difference between a tie and a slur, right?
Hmm.
And I don't know why she forgot it, but I had her record a video explaining them, why they look the same, giving us examples in music where there's a tie and what a slur looks like, how to tell the difference, and then to demonstrate them. And that is such a useful tool for students to have to put those thoughts together and then say them, and demonstrate them.
Yeah, it's relatively less time consuming to design a very intentional assignment like that, um, because then you put the student in charge of generating all that energy, that mental energy to jump the ranks, so to speak, in this Bloom's taxonomy,
Yeah.
and it creates something lasting that they can refer back to. Also,
Yeah, they can refer to their own tutorial video in the future.
very powerful. I
Yeah.
always do a composition notebook, especially for those learners who are more visual. Um, every lesson that I teach, I'll have them write it down in their composition notebook. And this is by no means an original idea. I know so many music teachers who do the same kind of thing. It's just note taking in class and outside of class for whatever you feel like is a valuable lesson you learned in piano class. But what really drove me to start doing this almost religiously with my students was the lockdown. When we had to suddenly switch to Zoom, I literally couldn't write on my whiteboard at at the studio anymore. So there was no way for me to really transmit information in a meaningful way that would stick in the minds of people who are especially visual in their learning style. And so I was like, you know what? I'll just write it here on my end, have them write it in their composition notebook on their end, and then there's a lasting kind of account. But what I like about Flip, or I haven't used Flip, but I'm just kind of going off what you're saying, is that it's so much. There's so many more dimensions to making a tutorial video. It's not something that you can just copy down and then forget about later, like when you're taking notes in chemistry class or something. You're going to remember that. It's very memorable because the student has to frame it in a way that they know someone else will be able to understand, not just them.
Absolutely. It's such a powerful tool because it does force them to originate those unique thoughts because they're not going to be able to use someone else's words for that. They can't just regurgitate my words because I feel like in the lesson sometimes when we ask them, well, what is a slur? They'll just, they'll just struggle their way through an explanation sometimes, and sometimes we'll even throw them a lifeline, right? Because it's so
Mhm.
painful to watch sometimes,
I
right?
Yeah.
And what I like about this is it gives them a chance to have their thoughts, edit their thoughts, and then record their thoughts, right? For the girl who or boy or other who records her videos and uses a script, and I mean that's wow, right? Like what an interesting thing that I saw. I started using Flip in the lockdown because everyone was really bad. I don't think that Zoom had an original sound button yet. There was just
Mm,
so much that was painful to listen to. I often couldn't hear them, right? Some people, they were just using a phone, and phone doesn't have original sound. So they would start playing. Zoom would be like, I got you. This is background noise. I'm gonna nuke it. No more music. No music allowed. And I'm like, you see your fingers moving. I can't hear you, right? So I used Flip then, and I had students record their pieces before their lesson that week so that I could listen to them. And then,
wow.
yeah. And then the Flip, I know we're going off on a tangent here, but I have a student working on the C sharp minor nocturne, Chopin, the posthumous one. And the videos are due by the halfway point in the week. And that's really great because if I assign a video that has to have a performance that accompanies it, like I just did that with a student who just learned about, I don't know what it was. Let's say fermata. We'll say fermata.
Okay.
And their video assignment was to explain what a fermata is, what it looks like, and then demonstrate it by performing the entire piece that has the fermatas in it in the
Mm.
lesson, right? So by forcing that to be by the middle of the week, I am helping to mitigate that phenomenon where, okay, I just had my lesson. I don't need to practice it. I don't need to practice. Oh no, it's right there. The lesson's right there. Let me practice a lot on the second half of the week,
Yeah.
right? So, but my Chopin, my student working on the Chopin Nocturne, um, they've been struggling with the polyrhythm, right? Because I mean, that is the big thing about the C sharp minor nocturne. It is almost like an etude on polyrhythms without actually being an etude on polyrhythms.
Mhm.
On well, just 2 verses 3. And well, there's 4 verses 35 at the end and 4 verses 17. So I suppose there's more polyrhythms there. But she's been having a hard time, as everybody does. Polyrhythms are, there's things we can say like not difficult, right? There's that one. You can slow it down, you can mark it out, divide like the beat into 12 parts, and then mark the triplet but I think ultimately it is something that students just have to break through that wall, and once they break through that wall they understand it, right?
Mhm.
But her assignments for the last couple of weeks has been to play the Chopin polyrhythm for me by the halfway point in the week, and then I'm able to respond with a video of my own telling her, no, this isn't quite right. There's a pause there. This note's going too fast. So, but that's me stepping off of it's free. Flip is free. It's completely free. You don't have to pay for it. Microsoft owns
Wow,
it.
nice.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm stepping off of I'm not sponsored. We're not sponsored by Flip, but if Flip wants us to sponsor them, you reach out and we can come up to an agreement here. Um, but back to phrasing. I have no idea. We took a long detour there off of we talked about the triangle, and then that took us, yeah, the taxonomy.
Yeah, I definitely have another thought on phrasing. Something that I've thought for many years as a performer and just as a teacher, which is the piano is one of those instruments, and especially because I play the violin too, and I can kind of compare and contrast. Sorry about the train in the background. Um, the piano is there. It is there. The piano is not moving anywhere, and so the only thing that's truly in motion, besides the actions of the keys in the piano, is our body. So what that means, is that we have to reconcile the fact that we cannot pick up the piano around and move it around in the same way that we could, say, a violin or a flute. Um, and that means when it comes to phrasing, a lot of phrasing is dealing with the way that the mechanics of the human body, um, kind of coalesce with the mechanics of this machine, this very soulful machine. And so when I like to, especially with my more advanced students or students who are older, we're talking about phrasing, say, especially with like a piece that uses a lot of pedal, things like that, or even pieces that don't. Um, I like to make sure that they feel grounded that the student feels grounded in each part of their body, um, so that when they're playing long phrases and passages, they feel like it feels natural enough to their arms, wrists, hands, and that every part of the body is moving kind of as one unified machine, efficient but graceful. Uh, and that's where gesture and phrasing both are involved in this. You can't have phrasing without gesture. And here in the US, I don't know if gesture is taught too much, but I have seen some amazing videos about, I think it's a piano studio in either Australia or New Zealand that uses really creative methods. I'm gonna have to look into what it's called, but really creative methods to teach gesture, such as, having the student, when they're doing crosshand arpeggios, or some crosshand technique figure where you're crossing over and under and over and under, and then at the end there's a flourish and the hands go up. Giving the teacher a high five, or something, or lifting the hand in an artful gesture in between playing when there's a rest or something like that. A flourish for the audience to enjoy and for the performer to enjoy as well. There are very creative ways that you could teach that.
That's really interesting because we focus so much on the sound, right? We focus so much on the sound, but piano performance is also a visual experience, right? I
Yeah.
always prefer piano recordings on like YouTube that don't show me the sheet music. I can find the sheet music. What I need to see is I need to see the performer because it's a more complete experience, right? And talking about performances and having good stage presence is all about that, right? Because do you sit down at the piano? Do you then place your hands on the piano and then think and then start? Or do you do your thinking in your lap and place your hand on the piano in the same stroke that you start playing, right? Which one of those looks more appealing, right? And it's not always the same for every piece. If it's a slow piece, you don't need to have a big dramatic drop into that first note, or a soft piece, you don't need to have it. But if there is a big bombastic opening, then just dropping in and playing at the same time is a much more visual experience, right?
Mm,
The music and your hands start at the same time, um, and having gestures where you lift your hands way up off the piano and you hold your hands in the air when you're done before you put them in your lap. Instead of just slopping them down into your lap after you play your first note. Those things are really interesting, and I think it's interesting that with a rest, if a student is struggling with it in the past. um I've done things because when the rests are introduced, there are only um it's not two hands playing two different sets of notes. It's one melody line that the two hands are doing together. I'll have them clap during the rest and then continue playing, right? It's
mm.
kind of funny because they have to rush to get their hands back on the piano, and they think it's funny because, well, they're clapping in the middle of a piano song. But by doing that, you are forcing them to take their hands off the piano. They can't hold
Yeah.
over that rest. They can't hold hold the note over into the rest because you're telling them that they need to clap. They need to physically take their hands off of the piano. And I have my students religiously tap their music, maybe religiously. They tap their music. I don't know what the word I'm looking for here is. They're very dedicated about tapping their music before they play. And a
Huh.
rest is palm face up because I tell them that rests need to be made. You need to make that silence in the same way you make noise, make music with the notes. So gestures are completely unrelated to what we're talking about. But I agree that gestures are important, and they can sweep a scale and show motion as they're going towards a high point in a phrase. And when they're dropping into a note, they can use a gesture. So I can definitely agree that gestures are important for us as teachers to use with our students. That wrist float off. Right, that wrist float off that the Faber Book One teaches, and it's an opportunity to also talk about how the mechanics of the piano work, um, because the piano is a big monolith. I mean, it's taller than kids, it's longer than kids, it's heavier than kids. And most kids, unfortunately, have a digital piano. So they don't ever get to experiment on their own with the mechanism of the piano, right? And how can you have a student do phrasing? How can you have students do phrasing if they have no idea what's going on inside of the piano, right? I
Mhm.
had I had a workshop. I have one of these workshops every couple of years, when I get sufficiently enough new students that it would be beneficial, where I take the piano action out of the piano and I take it onto my table here in the studio, and we talk about the different parts and what they do, and then we put the piano back, the action back inside the piano, and talk about the strings and the dampers. And I've only broken a hammer once doing it.
That is great. I mean, you got to introduce the action and the different parts of the piano and the dampers and all and the pedal at some point. Preferably right when they start lessons. I always open up my acoustic upright, or if we're at home here, the grand, and show them what's what. And it's very fascinating to any new pianist, to see that and at least get a partial understanding of how it works. I also wanted to go back to when you said that gesture was completely unrelated to phrasing, and say I definitely disagree, because Imagine using isolated muscle groups to try and achieve the same effect that you could with simply leaning in and using your body weight. Let's say you're playing a scale or something and it needs to crescendo for whatever reason because that's what the composer calls for, that's what the phrasing calls for. It'd be a lot easier to just put your body weight into it, or use some aspect of gravity, than to only use a downward force. Here we're going back to physics, to counteract the normal force and all of that of the piano and the action. So gesture matters, and it can make s- this activity of piano playing, which requires a lot of endurance throughout a piece, a little bit less energy draining. Um, you can use the mechanisms to fuel you as a player instead of drain you of your stamina that you need to have.
Yeah, absolutely. Piano technique can be we've defined it in past episodes, but it's all about how you use your body to achieve a desired sound, right? If
Mhm.
you have an alternating octave, in a hand, and you are not having your student rotate their wrist to achieve that sound, then you are doing them a disservice, right?
Yeah.
Because it is infinitely easier to just go like this rather than right? Rather than if
Hmm.
I was listening, I rotated my wrist and then I just used my fingers. It's infinitely easier for them to do it that way, and that's such an easy gesture, right? I ask, can you turn a doorknob for me? Can you turn a doorknob?
Yeah, that's
And then I
great.
said, we need to use doorknob here. And they're like, okay, I know what that means. We're going to use doorknob here, right? So gestures are absolutely important. And I agree it was unfair of me to say that they are unrelated to phrasing, because how we I think my definition of technique is achieving the desired sound in the laziest way possible, in the way
Hmm.
that requires the least amount of energy. So if you can lean in and use the weight of your torso and your upper body to help achieve a sound instead of having to work harder with your fingers or your arms, that's absolutely something that you should do, right? And it also helps us become better performers because we are more dynamic, we are not stiff as a board, and that's no one wants to see someone just sit there with their hands moving and none of the other parts of their body moving, right? We need to teach that, right?
Yeah, and I think that dynamics, as far as phrasing goes, when you're talking about dynamics, and we've talked about dynamics in a previous podcast episode too, but going to dynamics for a second, it's very exponential. I think, just as with something like speed and retardando or accelerando, um, when you have dynamics, there are so many probably curves involved. If you were mapping out the volume of a certain passage, um, like on a graph, you would see that it was very exponential or parabolic, and so is body weight. So yeah, I just think that it's less discreet and haphazard to use the gravity and the body and the potential energy and the kinetic energy, when you're creating those, because the desired effect is also of that same exponential kind of nature. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think it is. And this is all stuff that is difficult to explain to a child, right?
Oh yeah.
It's all difficult to explain to a child. So I think that when we know this, like, we have high level understanding of all of the things
Yeah.
that we're teaching to our students. And I think that one of the tricky parts is how do you take this high level knowledge and you boil it down to something very simple, right? How do you get it to be very simple? Because we've talked about all of these highfalutin ways to explain phrasing. We've talked about energy, we've talked about tension and release, we've talked about chords, we've talked about physics, right? And the fact is that a 9-year-old isn't going to get most of any of that, right?
Oh,
Uh,
I wouldn't explain it to a 9-year-old.
no,
I
I
would
know.
demonstrate it.
I know. Absolutely. Yeah. But some 9-year-olds, some kids, they really like to understand how it works, why it works, what are we doing? And it presents a challenge for us because sometimes the demonstration isn't enough. right? It's not
Mhm.
enough. And I think that demonstration alone is not enough to achieve true understanding, like we were talking about with the taxonomy, Bloom's taxonomy, right? Because if they've never if they struggle to understand the why behind it, then they're never going to be able to make that tutorial video about it, right? So
Mhm.
if you're listening and you don't explain the why, the how, and you just tell them what to do, that is, I think, a disservice to your students because they'll never be able to transfer that knowledge into a new phrase that you haven't taught them about, right? If you just tell them what to do, but not how, well, I suppose you probably tell them how, but not why or where or when, if you don't answer all of those questions, who, it's you. No, if you don't answer all of those questions, then you're going to struggle. They're going to struggle to ever implement that on their own. And phrasing is so fascinating because it's not something that's written into the music. I think phrasing might be one of the first purely interpretive choices that students get to make, right? Especially if you introduce it before the concept of a crescendo has been formally introduced in a book, or if you introduce it before, that I think Faber waits until 3B to introduce the concept of phrasing. I think they introduced it as a technique secret in 3B, and that's too long. That's way too long. That is not at all
Yeah.
appropriate, right? They can't be writing in crescendos and decrescendos for years without understanding why they're doing that, right? Phrasing should be able to be implemented without additional marks being put onto the page. That means that they understand it. They don't need to be told when to do it and where and what to do. They understand the principle behind it.
Mhm. You know, it's I don't know if this is the right or wrong way to go about teaching, but over the years, even as just a student of piano who is learning from another instructor, um, someone who really knows what they're doing, who has a PhD or a doctoral degree or something like that, master's, I find that a lot of teaching involves the art of convincing, and the way that you convince someone to choose a certain way to phrase something, a certain methodology, a certain way to play something over another way to be playing it. You can convince a student in so many creative ways. You could go all Mozart on them and just kind of play it disproportionately awfully with a mocking kind of this sounds awful, but to just mock, like how Mozart mocked Salieri in Amadeus when he was a kid and he was like pretending to be all ridiculous. You could do something like that, and it leaves an impression on the student without them even knowing really the why of why it's so bad to play with bad technique.
Yeah.
You could convince them using analogies. That was a huge part of Professor Edwards' pedagogy classes. She encouraged us to use analogies with our students who maybe may not have been advanced enough or not adults, but they could understand again scenarios that had little to do with music inherently, that still could apply via metaphor, simile, analogy, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's super important because children aren't ready for them to understand physics, the physics explanation for phrasing. They're not able to understand that. But I found that one way to check if a student has understanding is to ask them to play it badly on purpose. Can you phrase this terribly for me? Right? I use that when students make a mistake and then they finally play it right. I'm like, okay, you've played it right. Can you go back and play it the wrong way and tell me why
Oh my
it's wrong?
gosh.
Right? Go play it the wrong way. Play it the way you were playing it before and tell me why that's wrong. But with phrasing, you can absolutely I don't know if we should mock our students.
Oh, not the
No,
student,
I know. I'm just messing with
mocking
you.
some player, some
Right.
imaginary player.
Yeah, like just present it in a terrible way, and then present it in a good way, and be like,
Mhm.
what was wrong with what I did the first time, right? So one way to tell if your students really understand phrasing is to tell them to phrase it badly, and then have them phrase it well, and then explain the difference, right? That is a way to. I guess that's a way to help achieve that full understanding without providing a full wordy explanation to it, right?
That's interesting. I've never tried that. And my question about that would be, do you ever fear that they might inevitably like develop some muscle memory and like maybe accidentally learn to play it that way?
Well, they already did, right? Like if they came back after a week and they have a problem, they've already built that muscle memory. So we have to break that muscle memory. So by having them play it correctly, and then by having them play it the wrong way, and then tell me what's wrong with it, when they're practicing, they can monitor themselves, right? Because
Oh,
if they don't know why it's wrong and why it's right and what the difference is, how are they going to know throughout the week whether it's good or bad? How are they going to know whether they've fixed the mistake or not, right? So there is a level of trust that's inherent
mhm.
there with a student, right? Because you do risk that. But I don't usually use this when I introduce something, right? I wouldn't do this when I introduce something, but if a student comes back with a mistake, it's already muscle memory, right? That ship has already sailed. So we need to make it not muscle memory. And one more time playing it wrong is not going to make the situation any worse than it already is.
Oh, okay. So they've already been doing. That's interesting. I need to try that. Okay.
Yeah, I think that the first couple of times I did it, I was like, this seems kind of weird. But I find that in my own playing, right? In my own playing, if I need to know what the wrong thing is. Otherwise, how am I supposed to fix it? Right. So
Yeah.
after I've fixed it, if I play it the wrong way again, and then I'm like, okay, these are all of the ways that it's better now, right? I need to listen for that. I need to avoid that happening again. It helps, right? And it gives agency to them. You talked about at some point you talked about how to give them choice, right? How to give them that responsibility. And I do this with my students who understand the concepts behind phrasing. There's some
Mhm.
situations like when a scale is ascending, but it's the last note of the piece. We normally will decrescendo at the end of a phrase, at the end of a slur, the end of a musical phrase. Do you want to do that here? Or do you want to end on a high note, literally, and with our phrasing, right?
Mm.
And sometimes, sometimes they make the wrong choice. Sometimes they make the wrong choice, but I allow them to make that wrong choice because that's not their fault. It's my fault that they don't have the principles strong enough. So the next time I give them a choice, we will have discussed more about this particular choice that I'm giving them without them realizing it. So I should ideally have already given them the right answer, right? So how do you phrase this? Well, it's ascending. It's the end of a piece. I mean, you can take it either way, really. You can end triumphantly or you can end less, right? But the scale is ascending, and we usually make those. So maybe this is a thing that we need to add an accent on the end. We need to add some excitement there.
Mm.
And I don't stress out about the wrong choice. If they've misapplied the principles, I don't immediately correct them because that knocks their confidence down and it makes them feel like they don't know what they're talking about. And even if they don't know what they're talking about, I don't want them to feel like they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, I think like this kind of brings the whole Socratic method into mind for me, because you mentioned agency, and if you're able to facilitate learning such that a student can arrive at a sound conclusion on their own, something that will be memorable for them and make them feel like they had agency in arriving at that conclusion, so that they do that again and again in similar situations in the future on their own. That's great. And it could be something as simple as, depending on how old the student is again and where they're at, maybe an intermediate to advanced student, you could be like, do you feel how do you feel about this? what are your thoughts on that? Do you like this better or that better? Do a demonstration. And it helps them cultivate their tastes as well. I think that we're all, assuming that we don't have like amusia or some kind of thing going on, we're all inherently aware of what kind of music sounds good relative to other music. And you can kind of guide that a little bit, but it is innate. And so usually when I present students with options, they tend to choose the option that sounds best to the majority of people.
Yeah.
Which is great.
Yeah,
Convenient.
two things. First of all, sometimes when I have difficulty, I had a young brash composer. He was 17 and he's now in college for music. He didn't like going 5/1 in his compositions. And
Mm,
I understand that 5/1 is not the only thing that you can do, but 1/5/1 is kind of the foundation of music, right? If you want something to have a tension and then be resolved, 1/5/1 is essentially, you can add fours in there, you can replace five with seven, you can substitute chords, but ultimately it all comes down to 1/5/1, right? And he just didn't like it. He didn't understand why he had to do that. So I told him that 1/5/1 is coded into the fabric of the universe because of the overtone series. Right, I explained. We spent time talking about the overtone series, how it's an octave. It's the first partial, and then the next one after that is a fifth, right? And that fifth is the foundation of everything. We don't call the subdominant because it's the chord below dominant. We call subdominant because it's a fifth below tonic,
the
right?
time. Mhm.
Yeah, it's fit below the tonic. It's literally coded into the way the universe works, right? So um, he kind of got it, right? He kind of got it. And after talking about chord substitutions, how we're able to make progressive melodies by following these rules, and you're still able to write stuff that doesn't sound like 1/5/1, but still gives us the release. That made sense to him. So that why can be really important. And two, the one of the ways that I give students that agency is once they get out of their primer book, um, or if they're out of their adult level one book that I use and they're in the adult level two, I give them the option of picking one of those books back there from the level below them. And then each week they are responsible for an independent study piece. I think Chronister suggested this. Richard Chronister, one of the famous American pedagogues, suggested that students in college, and I don't like this in college, but students in college shouldn't be tests on the pieces they're working on with their teacher. They should be separately assigned separate pieces that are in similar in form and structure that they have to interpret and fix and practice completely on their own. And then that's what they get tested on. Because he's not interested, he said, I'm not interested in people mimicking what I'm teaching them. I want them to understand the principles behind that and then apply
Wow.
on their own. And first of all, that sounds like a nightmare. I would be so stressed going into a jury after 16 weeks of not having a chance to show it to my teacher, right? But for my students, they get a chance to apply their dynamics and their articulations and phrasing, voicing for more advanced students. I have a student that's playing stuff around the level of the B minor Chopin prelude. Da, da,
Mm.
da, 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 da. And she's working on pieces like The Wild Rider around that difficulty as her independent study piece every week. So every week they get a very short turnaround time on it. They get a week to work on this piece. Whatever state it's in after that week is over, we're moving on from it. So there's a bit of pressure placed on them there, but they have to interpret it on their own. They have to self-correct their mistakes because I'm not going to do it for them.
Wow. Yes, I remember talking about this chronister thing in school, and it is daunting for the teacher, maybe, perhaps, but it's a great way to really see for sure that the student is digesting these lessons and keeping these lessons in their arsenal for when they can evaluate and create.
Yeah. I use an app
Wow.
called MeisterTask, which is a task management app, which allows us to create stuff like checklists. And their practice notes are on there so that they have rich notes, they can keep track of where they are, what they're doing. I can provide links to YouTube videos, etc. But for their independent study pieces, I create the task for them, but I require them to make their own checklist of items that they need to make sure are correct. Students add stuff like phrasing, voicing, fix the rhythm in measure three, because they know that their rhythm in measure three is wrong. So it's a really strong independence building exercise for them, and it helps them feel good when they come back. And the response I give them is, that's really good, I love the voicing you did there at the end with the two
Mm,
hands, I love the phrasing. And it's also a motivational tool, because sometimes I'll be like, I really liked a lot of what you had here, I like the dynamics and stuff, but your phrasing kind of fell flat. So for your next independent study piece, I want you to see if you can spend more time on phrasing, and make sure that that gets the attention that it deserves.
mhm.
But
Wow.
I think it is about time for us to wrap up our podcast episode here. So our topic was phrasing, although we meandered quite a bit. What is your big takeaway for phrasing for this episode?
Well, meandering isn't necessarily a bad thing, I
No,
would
it's
say,
not.
and that seems to be the theme of our podcast, and I actually quite like it. I don't know about you. So my big takeaway, I would say, is, in order to teach phrasing, it is a job of helping facilitate the student's journey from just basic comprehension and application of a piece to getting to the point where they can analyze, evaluate, and maybe create something in the same vein. And it could take a lot of work, but the work can come from the student. What you mentioned about having the student create a tutorial video to explain certain concepts that are related to this, it's very powerful. And another big takeaway from me is that gesture is involved when we're talking about phrasing, because of the physics of things like dynamics, and even just the uh the kinesiology of piano. Okay. uh and those are my takeaways.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree with you. Having the Bloom's taxonomy reintroduced, it's a concept I was familiar with, but I kind of forgot it, because I mean, it's so long ago. And really, for a student to be able to do phrasing, they need to be at the top of the triangle, right? They need to have
Mhm.
that. They need to have that creating understanding. Use their information that they know to create something new, because that's what they do with every phrase, right? Every phrase, unless they are having us tell them exactly what to do, um, they are having to apply what they know about the piano's limitations in terms of decay, with the energy increasing, the tension increasing, and then it being releasing, up and down, pitch, contour. They're having to apply all of that stuff, and they can only apply the stuff that they know. So if their music starts getting more complicated, like for example the Chopin B minor prelude, right? There's a lot of spicy chords in there, and I don't think that my student would be able to label those chords and understand from a harmonic perspective. But I'm sure that she would be able to hear the tension of the chords, and then to know to lean into them physically and metaphorically, to create that, build higher tension, understanding repetition and the role it plays in creating that tension. These are all fundamental concepts that are related to phrasing, and knowing them is one thing. Being able to apply them to their own independent piece, or just telling them on a piece you guys are working together, let's work on the phrasing for this first phrase, and then this week I want you to create your own phrasing for the subsequent phrases, right? Being able to have that, a student can't do phrasing if they can't create their own phrasing, right? They're just following instructions at that point, and that's not truly interpretation. So I think that the taxonomy, that the Bloom's taxonomy is super important when it comes to interpretation, right? And that is why I enjoy working with adults so much, because they can begin reading between the notes and between the lines and seeing what's not there already much sooner than children can, in my experience. But perhaps that's just because I am not so sound forward when it comes to this. So my takeaways are that they need to understand the fundamental aspects of phrasing. They don't need to understand all of the different aspects of phrasing, right? They can learn phrasing just by pitch contour or by long notes and short notes. They can learn it just by that. And then as they go, they can get introduced to more and more dimensions of phrasing. But for them to be able to really say that they know how to interpret phrases, they need to have true understanding on at least one of the dimensions of phrasing. So sound forward and helping them to achieve helping them to achieve true understanding. They don't need to understand all of the dimensions of phrasing. And I think it's easy for me to forget that, right? There's so many different ways to conceive of phrasing, and they all go together to create a cohesive thing. But they can just do it with pitch contour. That's all they need at the beginning.
Yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, we will see you guys next week. Appreciate you listening, and goodbye.
Bye.